I'm Steve Blumenschein, the Interim Executive Director of CSU-WATER, and we at CSU-WATER are pleased to have the opportunity to host this webinar highlighting drought resilience, which features the work of the California Water Commission and CSU faculty experts. I want to give a quick overview of information I've received about the California Water Commission. The Commission has been tasked with supporting the Governor's Water Resilience Portfolio Initiative on policy options for managing drought. The focus of the Commission's investigation is on small, at-risk communities and water-dependent ecosystems in anticipation of future droughts. The Commission is bringing in different viewpoints to better understand the issue and will ultimately produce a white paper that will be delivered to state decision makers for their use when setting policies and making investments related to drought. So we in the CSU system are well positioned to support this effort via faculty experts, engaging students through teaching, research, and workforce development, and engagement with the many water-relevant centers and institutes throughout the CSU system. Our CSU Water basic operations and input from our CSU Water internal advisory group and campus reps aim to address California water issues broadly, inclusively, and beyond traditional STEM and agricultural disciplines. We need everyone to work together and share what you are doing on these fronts to maximize our engagement as the largest university system in the country. So I want to give you, because we don't get to convene often enough, I want to give you some updates on CSU Water and encourage your engagement and participation. So we formed this year campus representatives to create pipelines, using a bad pun, of connections among the CSU systems with CSU Water. And likewise, we could be disseminators of information opportunities to campuses through those representatives. And one of the main charges or projects we have in working with the campus reps is compiling a faculty expert list. And this will be used internally and externally. So for example, let's say that if you see a funding opportunity, like our faculty incentive program in CSU Water, which is now live, if you need a collaborator from someone from another CSU campus, this expert list will allow you to browse colleagues that you could work with at other campuses, for example, and build a relationship, not only for that proposal, but beyond, and other team formation. Likewise, our external partners are often asking us, do you have anyone who's an expert in like water economics? Oh, sure, we got a whole stable of people there. And we could help to build teams with those partners and for those partners. But it's good if they could also browse our faculty expert list to see the power of our research and teaching and engagement with communities and students and researchers at so many levels, especially with government agencies. And also, we're really excited this year to have a lot of growth, particularly through projects that are spearheaded by external collaborators. And you'll be hearing more of those as those evolve and we reach out for team members and announcements of those kinds of directions. And in addition to the campus reps, due to something that was spearheaded by a graduate student at San Jose State University, we formed a Student Advisory Research Council, which will launch very soon. And like the faculty expert list outreach, we'll be launching that program and recruiting students to join this advisory council through the campus reps. This will be a forum for both grad students and research active undergrads to come together and share their experiences, ideas, or brainstorming or problems. And in the meetings with this council, we'll bring in experts from our external partners, and they can talk about job opportunities and professional development for students interested in water careers. So look forward to that, please. So today's webinar features lightning talks by 5 faculty experts. Questions may be submitted via the chat, and then we'll have Q&A covered after the 5 lightning talks. So definitely feel free to submit questions in the chat as we go through each of the talks, but then we'll cover the question and answer overall after those 5 talks. So these talks will highlight faculty working in areas of drought resilience, which is of primary interest to our co-host Laura Jensen of the California Water Commission. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura for some remarks and welcome message.
Thanks so much, Steve. I'm so pleased to be here today and to be talking with all of you. And I'm really eager to hear from other presenters as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share a slide deck here. Let's see. Okay, so yes, I'm Laura Jensen. I'm the Assistant Executive Officer of the California Water Commission. And Steve, you did a great job of introducing our work, so I'll get to skim through a couple of slides here. But just wanted to say briefly a little bit about the California Water Commission in case folks aren't familiar with our work. We serve as an advisory capacity to the Department of Water Resources, as well as to the California Natural Resources Agency, the administration, and the legislature when requested. And the primary way that we do that is we hold public meetings, so monthly or near monthly on the third Wednesday of the month, that are governed by our 9 commissioners who are governor appointed, 2 for their environmental knowledge and then the others for general water knowledge, and they come from across the state and have very diverse backgrounds. And so at those public meetings, what we are doing is we are hearing diverse perspectives on water management and policy issues in this time of climate change, and then leveraging that to bring forward, to really flesh out our advisory role. So that's kind of the basis for our engagement on this topic of drought. Okay, so this is the portfolio, water resilience portfolio action that we have been asked to support at this point. Our engagement in this work comes at the request of the Secretaries for Natural Resources, Environmental Protection, and Food and Agriculture. And as Steve mentioned, what we're looking at are ways for the state, strategies for the state to use to protect communities and species in the event of drought, and predominantly looking at small rural communities who are the most vulnerable to drought. You'll note that the action itself there says drought lasting at least 6 years. That's something that we jettisoned fairly early on because we heard from experts that felt arbitrary and impacts need to be dealt with more immediately than that. So that's sort of the basis of our work here. And then again, Steve, you hit on this really nicely. So here's what we've been doing. We've been engaging experts and interested parties in the public, gaining a wide perspective on the topic, developing potential strategies that include investments and policies that will then get packaged in a white paper or guidance document that goes back to the secretaries who requested our work and will be used by the secretaries and decision makers as they're implementing this action. So these are the preliminary strategies that we developed, and these were born of a drought working group that we put together that consisted of interested parties representing a wide variety of interest groups connected to water in the state, as well as partner agencies. And the participants in the working group were very much focused on bold and actionable strategies, and they very generously gave us a good chunk of their time to work through this structured consensus-seeking process to develop a suite of potential strategies. So the strategies that we have here, and each one has actions binned underneath it that I will walk through. These strategies were developed collaboratively and had broad buy-in from the interest groups represented in our drought working group. But the strategies and the actions aren't final. So I'm very much eager to learn from you guys today and to get direct feedback on the work that we've put together here. So I will just kind of talk through each one of these, and then it sounds like we're going to take questions at the end. So scaling up groundwater recharge is, of course, a hot topic right now, given the wet winter that we experienced last winter. And this strategy is really linked to something that we heard through our early conversations with experts in California, people who are managing water in other Western states, and then representatives from other drought-prone countries. So we heard some universal themes, and one of those was you really have to be thinking about and managing for drought during non-drought times. And so that's definitely comes to play here when we're talking about scaling up groundwater recharge, which is really talking about, when other water rights and environmental needs are met, diverting as much water as possible to be able to recharge our groundwater basins. And the actions that the Commission is proposing include better preparing for recharge by identifying where it provides the greatest benefit as where it provides multiple benefits and where it's even possible given land use and infrastructure. Promoting recharge through outreach and education, as well as financial incentive programs, and promoting recharge through efficient permitting that really clarifies flood triggers when you can take water off the system, but also, considers potential impacts to drinking water and the environment. And then action number 4 there is talking about the state supporting the infrastructure that's needed. And primarily we've been hearing about conveyance infrastructure to move water around to places where you can recharge it. And then lastly, action number 5 is acknowledging that we are learning a lot right now, and there's a need to continue to extract lessons learned and improve and become more efficient as we advance groundwater recharge. So all of this is, the state is working on groundwater recharge right now. And this is pointing to the state really focusing on identifying places for recharge that have the greatest benefit and multiple benefits, thinking about financial incentives to really spur recharge and move it forward, both for landowners as well as for infrastructure uses, so that we can build on the momentum that's happening right now. Our next strategy, this is our species strategy, but really in talking about species, we're talking about the ecosystems on which species rely. And I will say that we were asked specifically to do a bit of a close look at the topic of species protections during drought. In August of last year, the Newsom administration put out a water supply strategy that acknowledges that we are in this time of increasing water scarcity due to a hotter and drier climate, and then proposes some strategies and metrics that we should be hitting to ensure that communities and agriculture have protections. But it leaves out species. So there's a bit of a gap there that we've been asked to fill. And it's of course important because species are hit very hard by drought. They're in decline during all water year types, and just their populations aren't rebounding. So the first action that we've identified there is developing environmental watering plans. And this is really comes from Australia and something that they did during their millennium drought. But watering plans are a strategic decision tree for how to manage water for species. So basically operates within the constraints of existing and projected hydrologic conditions for a given water year, and says, okay, how are we going to meet species objectives given the amount of water that we have, and also water supply objectives. But then that, of course, needs to be paired with actual physical habitat on the ground. So really looking at where are drought refugia and our biological strongholds, and how can we advance priority habitat restoration and conservation so that species have both the water and the other physical resources that they need to be able to weather droughts. And then lastly, we've got integrating fire and forest management into those types of planning. Fires emerging as one of the most impactful things of our modern hot droughts, of course, are impacting communities as well as species, but we've bundled them here because of the proposed approach of this kind of landscape scale planning. So this really represents a bit of an ideological shift for the state, which when it comes to drought has been kind of doing this ad hoc single species approach to protecting species. And this is asking for some advanced planning to really identify these habitat and species and ecosystem priorities in advance of drought. Our third strategy is looking at how to better position communities during drought emergencies. And the first action acknowledges that the boots on the ground when it comes to drought emergencies are local. They're the ones who are responding to the impacts of droughts. But the state is frequently funding some of those efforts, and the state can do a better job at being a little bit more nimble with its funding, or innovative with its funding, to allow those boots on the ground to be more nimble. So for instance, this would be kind of having some pre-approved dollar categories and activities that would allow folks to really try and fast track emergency response. And we've also been hearing and talking a little bit about climate disaster funding rather than a binned drought or flood funding, because we are seeing this weather whiplash and swinging between the two so quickly. And then action 2 is thinking kind of beyond this emergency response. What do these communities need? And again, the state is doing work here. They're doing work on water supply reliability for communities through things like interties and consolidations. But this is really asking the state to kind of be more aggressive in its timelines and ramp that up. And then lastly, we've been hearing, again, a fair amount in our conversations about this, about, acknowledging that water use is linked to land use, and thinking about this is sort of prodding the state to think about where it can provide guidance to integrate those two, so that we're thinking about water use when land use in the context of land use planning. And then our last strategy here, this one kind of underpins the other ones. It's getting at capacity and information and sort of the structures that are needed to be able to advance drought work. The first action calls for dedicated drought capacity, staff capacity at state agencies. The way it works right now is that when an drought emergency is declared, people are pulled from their day jobs to deal with the drought emergency, and then they go back to their day jobs afterwards. But of course, California is a drought-prone state. We know we're going to head back into drought. On top of that, we've got this increasing water scarcity due to climate change. And even when we're not in a statewide drought emergency, drought has long tails. There are communities and species that are suffering from drought after we're officially out of an emergency. So we need the capacity to be able to think about that. So we have better coordination between agencies across sectors, so that we can extract lessons learned and apply them to planning ahead of time for drought, and really be collecting and sharing and looking at data during and outside of these statewide drought emergencies on communities and species in crisis. The second action supports seasonal forecasting to anticipate drought. That helps the state better manage water, knowing what's coming down the pike from a precipitation perspective. Number 3 acknowledges that the state's not acting alone, that tribes and local governments and NGOs are the connective tissue that are really liaising between the state and local areas when it comes to droughts, and they too need support in their drought capacity. And then lastly, we spent a fair amount of time with our working group talking about a public information campaign. Of course, there are lots of public information campaigns happening about drought. The state has its own, and then a lot of local water agencies are doing great work. But this is talking about the state helping to educate Californians so that they really understand water in the state, not just during drought, but what's happening right now with our weather whiplash and our changing hydrology, so that there's a greater awareness and we can trigger behavioral shifts when needed, when we do have these severely constrained water supplies. So we are starting to turn towards drafting our white paper. We plan to have a draft out in October, and then a final one before the commission in November. And I'll just end by saying that I've got an open door. So I certainly would appreciate any thoughts or feedback people have time to share today, but can also be contacted via email or phone at any time. I'm happy to hear from folks. And with that, I will stop and turn it back to you, Steve, to move us forward.
Great, Laura. Thanks so much. That's so interesting and exciting to hear these, looking ahead plans. Right? It's like the 3 little pigs. We want the house made of bricks, not straw or mud, for example. So it seems like in state government, the word of the day is resilience. And we're seeing that in so many places. For example, messaging we're getting from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and Strategic Growth Council and others. And I like the fact that we could connect water to anything by about 1 degree. So we're looking at and trying to be active in fronts with climate resilience, energy resilience, and we can connect those to water pretty easily. So we do want to look and act broadly, across disciplines and interdisciplinary teams, and get the word out to our students and our networks in the CSU system and beyond with our external partners. And then, Laura, you mentioned that are the webinars still ongoing? Or are you taking a break from that to work on the white paper? Can we still have engagement?
Yeah, so we did host public workshops, and we concluded those in July. So we've completed that. But again, so the best opportunity for continued engagement is through the actual commission meetings. So we will present a draft white paper at the October meeting. There's opportunities for public comment, written leading up to the meeting or verbal at the meeting. And then the final, we believe we will be taking in November to the commission, unless they have want us to extend that time period. So that's another opportunity for comment, formal comment. But again, informal comment, I really welcome at any time if people want to reach out to me to talk about the topic.
likewise, we could definitely push, we could have push to our internal network of those announcements and opportunities, and people could sign on to get those directly, right?
Yeah, you folks can sign up for our email list on our website. But I will certainly, now that I've got you and Jennifer and Laura already was sort of in my crosshairs and on my contact list, I will be updating you when we kind of reach these milestones, and then you can share it with your larger group.
Yeah, so I attended, I believe it was the July workshop. That was fascinating. It was great. Breakout rooms and discussions from so many different types of people. It was really fantastic. So
Yeah,
looking forward to where that's going to go.
we have heard from a really wide cross section. And so our job is to really try and chart that through line, taking what we have heard and trying to move forward with that. So I will say that from our public workshops, we've been talking about these strategies now for several months, but from our public workshops, we did hear a lot about soil health. So that's getting a new look. We heard additional emphasis on the land use planning side of things. So that's getting a bit of an additional look. So yeah, it's very interesting to be talking to so many different people, and challenging to figure out what is it that we can serve up to state decision makers that feels like it's got good consensus that they could move forward with easily.
While navigating California's complex water policies and
Right.
rights.
Yeah.
That's another webinar, but
right.
Okay. So I think we're all looking forward very much to our lightning talks, and Laura had a say in what we're going to hear forthcoming. And I want to note to our audience that, and people listening to the recording, that most of the lightning talks you'll see, those slides will be posted online. So in our CSU-WATER website, we have an events section, and webinars are certainly in events there. So we'll have this recording and then some of these talk files and other things. So Laura, that might be a good opportunity for you to, any flyers or info things you want posted or links, we could include that in this event compiling on our website, right? So just keep that in mind, if you would, in the midst of all this. All right, so let's get rolling. I'm very pleased to present our first speaker, which is Jennifer Alford of CSU San Bernardino. And for those of you, should also know that Jennifer is the Associate Director of Research for CSU-WATER. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate that. All right, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate this opportunity, and just so exciting to hear a lot of what the commission is sharing. It definitely aligns with what we've been talking about on our campus at Cal State San Bernardino, which led last year to developing our Institute for Watershed Resiliency. And so if you're not familiar with our campus, we actually have two locations. One is in the heart of San Bernardino at the base of the mountain and foothills region, which includes the San Bernardino National Forest. And then we have a second location out at Palm Desert near Palm Springs, which you've probably read a lot about in the news recently. So the landscape that we service has a lot of disadvantaged communities and really dynamic environmental landscapes. So drought is always a concern for us, although the shifting weather conditions have definitely kept us on our toes. So we see a lot of opportunities and challenges to include our students with agency work that they're doing, so that our students can be better informed and stewards, but also for workforce development. And so what I'll highlight today, we have a lot of great partnerships here. CSU Northridge is one of them that I'll speak to you in just a second. But the two main programs we've been working on over the past year that will continue is our Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program that is administered through the Department of Conservation and then funded locally through the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District. And that's who we and CSU Northridge are working with. We also have a Headwaters Monitoring Program. And then to ensure that we have longevity beyond grants and when programs terminate, as far as funding, we have a Headwaters Resiliency Partnership that's been formed for our area. So really our goal as an institute is to ensure there's academic threading across all of these activities, and that comes from curriculum to students out in the field getting hands-on training. So our Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, we've interacted with this program in different ways. Some of our courses have been involved in doing forest stand assessments, which do include looking at drought conditions. They look at invasive species and are teaching students to look at that micro to macro watershed scale about the various conditions we're seeing on the landscape, and then how we can adopt different strategies to mitigate those issues. But also in this program, we have community capacity building. So in our next year phase, we'll be doing a survey to understand more from the communities that are impacted about fire and related things like drought considerations that we need to be thinking about as an institution, but also with our agencies. And so a lot of what this work is going to culminate in is a more collaborative, adaptive management strategies that apply to our region and are not a one-size-fits-all. The second program we have going on that's been established for over 4 years now is a extensive monitoring program. And so we sit at the ridgeline of the Mojave Basin headwaters and the Santa Ana Basin headwaters, which are very populated and need to understand the drought and various impacts that can happen from the change in hydrology. So we look at water quality and quantity biweekly. And so we use this information to inform water resource management. So for example, when things that have been flowing at base flow are no longer flowing, and we're seeing those trends and those windows of opportunity for surface flows to exist over time narrow, then we are able to, think about different strategies that we can apply to that. And so this also, provides workforce development, data sharing, and public education opportunities. So to bring this all together and to make sure that our efforts don't die out at some point, we worked with a collaborative group headed up by the San Bernardino Valley Municipal Water District to create the Headwaters Resiliency Partnership. And so really what this is helping us to do is collaborate on monitoring and planning across multiple agencies and multiple objectives, but a single landscape. It helps us to think about adaptive best management practices, again, trying to think what works best for our region, to monitor them and to see the effectiveness of it so that we can pivot when we do have extreme weather changes occurring on the landscape. This also provides professional development opportunities where our students and practitioners are in the same learning space. And so that, again, is starting to help us create feedback loops where our students can get employed with these different agencies, and then they can come back and be mentors to our students. And it's really creating a hub of shared resources and expertise across the various agencies. So to see the true impact, this is a long list, but these just in the past couple of years, this is what my graduate students have been working on, the type of research they've been working on. And so it's very regionalized, looking at these issues through different lens. But what it's also led to is jobs with them and the agencies that we partner with. So there has a lot of longevity to it. And I think that that's really the power of working with the CSU, but also the power of our CSUs working together with agencies like the Water Commission. So looking forward, we are going to be expanding our Headwaters monitoring program to include that ground to surface monitoring and those trends that occur, especially with climatic changes. We're looking to create a Headwaters monitoring lab where we can centralize our monitoring efforts and start to really think about an interdisciplinary lens to solutions. And then starting a field school. This will be the first schools where 3 CSUs will be working together, and we hope to expand that in the future. So we'll be working with Northridge and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo as well. And then lastly, thinking about that practitioner edge and how our students can kind of get more involved early on. And so we're looking at planning and management certificates that range from looking at issues of water resources and resiliency, from cybersecurity all the way to environmental education. If you have any questions for me, I have my contact information up here. I would welcome the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And also remember, you could submit your questions or comments for discussion from all the speakers when we wrap that up. So you can put those in the chat, please. So our next speaker is Megan Jennings from San Diego State University.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here. Let me get my slides up. Well, thank you. I'm excited to share, especially after hearing Laura's presentation about the work that we're doing out of San Diego State. I'm a research scientist at San Diego State and a co-director of the Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management. And we have an ongoing project that's built on some prior projects focused on ecological drought in Southern California, and really thinking about how we can integrate science into management planning and action. So this is a project that is funded by NOAA's out of their National Integrated Drought Information System program, Coping with Drought. And they had a call specifically focused on ecological drought. So we're working at San Diego State. My co-PIs are at STSU and the Climate Science Alliance, as well as the Desert Research Institute. And we have some climate advisors out of the Western Regional Climate Center and UC Santa Barbara's Climate Hazard Center to help us sort of link together the ecology and climatology. Many of you are probably familiar with this, this paper and this graphic, but it's really powerful for us here in Southern California, where basically we have the highest variability of precipitation across the entire United States. We get so little that if we're in a boom or a bust year, it makes a really big difference for us. And so thinking about that, we wanted to think about how we could be better prepared for drought. Ecological drought, if you're not really familiar with that terminology, is just thinking about what these ecological impacts are of drought, where ecosystems, may be shifting beyond thresholds of vulnerability. We're seeing impacts to ecosystem services that then affect our communities, or just feedbacks in natural and or our human systems. And, Laura talked about species impacts. That's all part of this, as well as ecological processes. I'm an ecologist, so this is where I sit and this is what I think about. And I work a lot with natural resource managers. And part of the reason we designed this project was in a prior project funded by the California Strategic Growth Council, connecting wildlands and communities. We were really thinking about how could we help think about what happens in our natural systems and our built environment and better connect the two by focusing on issues related to water quality and quantity, fire risk, and biodiversity. As part of that, we worked really closely with local jurisdictional planners, as well as the usual suspects I work with, natural resource managers and land managers. And one of the really important things we were starting to hear is, about how well prepared people were, or what responses were like, and how could we integrate adaptation into work that's already being done. So in a recent webinar we held on this drought project, we asked people, what are your current response approaches? Are you proactive, reactive in a prompt manner? Is it lagged? Are you not doing anything? I mean, I was surprised that about a third said that they were being proactive, that their organization was proactive. But of course, the folks that are here on the right-hand side of the slide, want to work harder, I think, to respond more proactively and be more effective in their drought strategies. And that's where we come in. So our goal with this project is really help provide a framework where we can use science in management practice. We want to foster, a community of practice. So those folks who are proactive, what are you doing and how are you doing it? How can we learn from each other? What kind of data do you need, research needs and products that are regionally specific that work for Southern California? How can we, improve the accessibility of that research for our region? And then ultimately support strategic and science-informed decision-making. So when we ask people, what did they want to see emphasized in a drought response strategy? Conservation, habitat restoration, biodiversity, things that are really important to the conservation and natural resource community here in Southern California, obviously came up at the top of the list. And you can delve into this word cloud after the fact if you want to look more deeply, because we got lots of really great responses. And so what we're trying to do is sort of better connect data, and in particular, ecological data and climate data. And so, through the CWC project that I mentioned, interesting that we share an acronym there, connecting wildlands and communities in this case, what we're trying to do is better link some of these drought indices that, tell us more about climatic conditions with data that we produced as part of that project. So things about fire risk and post-fire recovery, priorities and vulnerabilities for species protection and refugia, and then for water, thinking about quality and quantity, and also linking that to the built environment. So this is really about data integration and sort of merging, the fact that we have data at different scales and with different focus when we're talking about climate-related data and ecological-related data. And we're hoping that this can help us respond better to ecological drought, in particular thinking about protecting ecosystem processes. So things like maintaining hydrologic flows, reducing the risk of ecologically damaging fire, promoting healthy post-fire recovery, and then on the biodiversity side of things, preventing severe impacts for sensitive species, thinking about drought-informed habitat management, and as well as restoration strategies. Do we want to change palettes of species or planting times or, other kinds of strategies when we undertake this work to make sure it will actually be effective? So we're working on doing all of this in a scenario-based approach, because it's not just about drought, as we all know, having lived through not only the last year, but just the last week, in fact, in Southern California, that we've got boom or bust. And so helping people think about what would you do in these different scenarios where we have, sorry about that. We have more precipitation in some conditions and less in others. And so really identifying strategies, figuring out, what would be the approach, and in particular, better linking the seasonal and subseasonal forecasting data that our climatology colleagues are busy working on that I think are not used really frequently by natural resource managers. So hopefully this will help us get to response and adaptation strategies, both short and long term, working towards drought monitoring together and being more flexible and adaptive in our management. So with that, thank you. And here's our project website. I'll drop some links into the chat afterwards.
Great, thanks, Megan. And others can submit questions or topics for discussion in the chat as well. So our next talk also hits on one of the California Water Commission's strategic points. I think we're getting on a roll here with that. And this will be by Alireza Faramand of Cal State LA.
Okay. Hi, thank you very much, Steve. And thank you for the CSU-WATER organizers for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm an assistant professor at Cal State LA, and I'm also a NASA JPL affiliate where I work as a postdoc and then later as a research associate. So one of the major focuses of my research has been on drought monitoring. So since my grad studies, and I'm going to talk about three of my ongoing research projects. So the first one is about drought early detection or drought onset detection. So for those of you who may not be familiar with drought definition, so we have different types of droughts. So we have a meteorological drought, which is typically defined as deficit in precipitation. We have agricultural drought, which is typically defined as deficit in soil moisture. And we have a hydrologic drought, which is typically defined as deficit in runoff or groundwater storages. So drought early detection mainly relates to the topic of meteorological drought. And why are we concerned about drought early detection? Because it is very important in several sectors, including agriculture and water. So for example, water managers can better do water resource planning. Farmers could purchase less fertilizers and increase their insurance coverage before the growing season. And typically precipitation is most commonly used for drought onset detection, but our research showed that the near surface air relative humidity, temperature, and vapor pressure deficit, or VPD, from the NASA EARTH mission, which was launched back in 2002, have the potential to detect the drought onsets earlier than precipitation. And so we have been delivering the NASA EARTH-based drought products of relative humidity, temperature, and vapor pressure deficit to the U.S. Drought Monitor every week. So as you might be familiar with, U.S. Drought Monitor is a major agency in the U.S. which they combine various inputs from objective inputs and subjective inputs to come up with drought maps every week. And our variables have been one of the inputs to the generation of the U.S. Drought Monitor maps. So a second topic, it's going to be about multivariable drought monitoring, which is going to apply to all three types of droughts here listed: meteorological, agricultural, and hydrologic one. So for this project, I worked on developing a flexible drought monitoring framework, which can monitor drought based on either a single variable, such as precipitation in the top panel, or soil moisture here in the middle panel, or a bivariate of both, which is precipitation and soil moisture. So as we know, droughts are complicated and they require multiple sources of input for monitoring. And this novel framework allows for a comprehensive assessment of drought. It can be applied for one or two variables, and it also can be applied to a range of hydrologic variables such as precipitation, runoff, terrestrial water storage, and etc. And the software is available for public use already. And the last project, which is the most recent one, is a drought cascade in the hydrologic cycle, which is also applied to all three types of droughts listed here. So as we know, droughts initiate in the atmosphere, but they have this cascading effect through the hydrologic cycle. And it's very important to characterize this cascade phenomenon. And for the first time, we looked at satellite observations of vapor pressure deficit, precipitation, terrestrial water storage and soil moisture to characterize this cascade phenomena for 4 major US drought case studies in large scales, including a 2012 Midwest drought, 2012-2016 California drought event, 2011 Texas, and a 2006-2008 Southeast drought. And what we found was that we find characteristic lag times in the propagation for drought onset, termination, and timing from mainly precipitation to soil moisture and terrestrial water storage. This is one example from a California drought event I'm highlighting here. So you see that there is around a 3-month time lag from precipitation, which is the red sign, to soil moisture, which is yellow, all the way to terrestrial water storage. There is 8-month lag from soil moisture to terrestrial water storage as it propagates from soil moisture to TWS. And VPD doesn't show major signals for this particular event. And I'm gonna stop here, and thank you very much for this opportunity, and my contact info are here.
And I want to find out more about that if we have time in our Q&A section. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Laura Huning of CSU Long Beach.
All right, so as mentioned, I'm Lori Hunning. Today I'm going to be talking about some research that I've been doing related to snow droughts. And, given the audience, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the vital importance of snow to California water. Instead, we're going to just jump in and talk about snow droughts. So when I'm talking about snow droughts, what am I referring to? Well, you can think of this as just a deficit in snow water equivalent, or SWE. So that's the amount of water stored in the snowpack for a particular location and a particular time of the year. So let's take a look at some work I did over the Sierra Nevada. And so we wanted to understand what the SWE response is to warming over this mountain range. And we looked at a 1 to 2 degree increase in the winter temperature. And what we found was that for this increase of warming, this leads to about a 20 to 40% increase in the likelihood of having below average snow water equivalent. So not only does that mean that, with a lower snowpack, there are going to be water resources challenges, but along with that, you can also think about, we're getting pushed toward being more prone to drought characteristics and conditions. And across the Western US, we've seen many times with drought, we often have very active wildfire seasons. So along with this warming, we also see that the snowpack is pushed up to higher elevations in the mountain range, oftentimes. And also this corresponds then to, changes in flooding potential, also the effectiveness of our in situ observational network. So expanding this idea of snow droughts to both the global perspective, we generated a framework to be able to do that. What I'm going to show you right now is just a few highlights from our work over the Western US, where we again use this snow drought framework. So we looked at differences in snow drought duration, as well as the chance of having a higher probability, a higher intensity of snow droughts across the region. And actually our key results for the Western US are summarized there on the right. So we found that over the last 20 years, relative to an earlier period, so the previous 20 years, there's been about a 28% increase in snow drought duration. And it also became about 15% more likely to have more intense snow droughts relative to that previous period. So we looked at this type of framework. We, as I already mentioned, expanded it to the global scale. And not only did the Western US emerge as one of these snow drought hotspots, but so did Europe and Eastern Russia. So all 3 of these areas are experiencing, over the most recent 20-year period, an increase in drought duration, as well as a likelihood of having more intense or more severe snow droughts across these areas. And so with the framework that we've developed to be able to monitor changes in our snowpack, we can capture not only dry spells or droughts, but also wet spells and anything in between. So there's potential to integrate this work into a broader drought assessment so that we'll have additional information related to snowpack incorporated into those drought monitoring frameworks. And what's really exciting about this work is that we've been able to take it to the next step and start to look at impacts. So one of the recent studies that we published was related to understanding how shifts in snow drought duration, intensity, as well as changes in timing of snowmelt, how that would be impacting agricultural regions around the world, and trying to understand which areas, which large agricultural basins are potentially needing to look for kind of a shift in their irrigation sources, given shifts in snowmelt. And then further extending this, thinking about international trade, which areas are affected by changing snowpack in coming years in the future. Well, what we found was that through international trade, this actually reshapes who is exposed to snowmelt patterns and the changing snowpack. In particular, we saw that with 2 to 4 degrees of warming, you know, even if an area doesn't directly receive snow or use that to irrigate their crops through imports and exports, nearly all countries around the world will be affected by our changing snowpack. And so just to wrap this up, thinking about future projections, but bringing us back to the Western US, I just want to highlight one really key finding from our work across the Western US when we looked to climate projections for SWE, is not only that we see an increasing SWE loss projected across the region, but if we look at California relative to the other basins across the Western US, California is expected to have to be the first to experience this several back-to-back years of snow drought or low to no snow conditions. So California is projected again to be the first one to experience 5 consecutive years and also 10 consecutive years of having its basin area of 50% or more experience these low to no snow conditions. And so with that, I'll just wrap it up here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. There's really fascinating breadth of geographical scope and scale, as well as discipline. When you popped up the food production network and trade, that was just over the top. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
And then our next talk is from Danielle Bram of CSU Northridge.
Yes, hi everyone. Great to be here. So we are actually going to pivot a little bit here and talk more about water and community engagement. And so my name is Danielle, as Steve indicated. I am the director of the Center for Geospatial Science and Technology at CSU Northridge. And CGST, our center, has had the privilege to work with a large group of incredible partners. You can see all the logos here. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but they do include WRPI, which is now known as CSU-WATER, and Jennifer Alford, who you already heard from. So this extensive group of partners worked on this project related to addressing water inequalities and injustices in Southern California, called the Disadvantaged Community Involvement Program. And our CGST's primary role in the project was to provide geospatial data management, development, analysis support, along with application and online survey development. I'm going to share with you briefly today what our project goals were and how we achieved them. So this project spanned 5 different counties in Southern California: Ventura, LA, Orange, San Bernardino, and Riverside County, and 3 urban regions: the Watersheds Coalition of Ventura County, Upper Santa Clara, and the Greater Los Angeles County Urban. This was funded by Prop 1 via the California Department of Water Resources. So we had 3 main goals. The first one was to identify, engage, and educate disadvantaged communities. The second goal was to perform needs assessments for both communities, including tribal groups and water agencies. And the third goal was to develop data-driven solutions for selecting projects for technical assistance. And by that, we mean we developed an online applications that uses data to help prioritize and select projects. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So as you can guess, the foundation of this project was built on data and information. We collected a large number of data sets, including here, for example, you can see water service provider boundaries. That data set is quite extensive. It's sort of a mess right now, but it's in the process of being cleaned up by the State Water Board, I believe. We did take a pass at it, and the State Water Board is finishing cleaning it up. All the information that we collected and processed was placed into this DAC Data Hub site, which is available to the public. And it's an online repository, so you can search for specific data sets and even download them. Another phase of this project involved disadvantaged community modeling. So as a lot of you might know, DACs, or disadvantaged communities, can be defined and identified in various ways using different variables. The most common way to identify DACs is by mean household income. And that one, for example, is used in DWR's DAC mapping tool that a lot of you might be familiar with. However, there are some limitations that are inherent in that type of data set due to the fact that it relies on coarse scale census tract boundaries. So this project team explored some other models and ways to better identify DACs. We explored a stress model, and then ultimately ended up using a street-weighted model, which applies a street-weighted aerial interpolation process to provide a more accurate picture and a higher resolution picture of where DACs exist in the project area. The next phase in the project is community outreach and education. So this project we refer to it as the DACIP project, or also the Water Talks project. So the team developed a Water Talks webpage to facilitate outreach. And there's all sorts of resources and information on this page. There's the link. I can also put that link in the chat after the presentation. We also developed a number of what we call toolkits and story maps, which provided local water information to specific neighborhoods and communities. In collaboration with community partners, numerous outreach events were scheduled and held to actually directly engage with community members. And one of the main objectives of that effort was to help empower communities to help them advocate for themselves. The phase after that involved the community and institutional or agency needs assessment. We following the community engagement phase, we conducted surveys and interviews with both community members, groups, and water agencies, institutions, in order to produce a needs assessment. You can see one of the needs assessment dashboards that was developed, which highlights important questions that were asked and provides a dynamic interface to view responses. So if you were to go onto this dashboard, you could actually zoom in into certain areas, and the responses here would change based on the geographic extent of where you were zoomed in. After those needs assessments were complete, the next step was to develop a project evaluation.
You have 30 seconds, please.
Thank you. I'm almost done. The next step is to develop a project evaluation tool, and we called that tool the Technical Assistance Proposed Projects Evaluation Dashboard, or TAPT for short. And what this project evaluation tool did was it helps to assist decision makers with data-driven project evaluation and selection tools. It uses tools called multi-criteria decision analysis tools on the back end to make decisions about how to prioritize these different technical assistance projects. This tool is interactive and user-friendly and intended to be used for grant managers and project managers. So key information from project concepts or proposals from communities and agencies was fed into this tool. And what happens is project managers can go in, funding managers can go in, they can select project types. For example, whether a project is an education project or it's project development, they can select criteria such as DAC status, if something's a DAC or a severe DAC, the population of an area. They can assign the relative importance of those different criteria. And then they can get a list of ranked projects based on the selection and the importance of the different criteria. This helps provide a data-driven approach and helps remove some of the subjectivity in selecting projects. This is to inform project selection. It doesn't directly tell funding managers exactly which projects to select. It is up to them ultimately, but this can help inform the process. Okay, the last thing I'm just going to mention really quickly is that the project is essentially complete. However, the extended project team is working on tying up a few loose ends and developing an updated website that has less project-specific information, but instead offers generalized resources and links to communities and agencies to help keep them informed with regards to water resources. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Such an exciting project. I'll start off with a question and then turn it over to Laura Jennings, see if she has a question. So I know any of our fantastic guest speakers could answer this, but I'm going to tab you, Jennifer. Jennifer, it's so impressive, the diversity and number of groups you brought together on this work. Could you give a few inspirational words to faculty who may just be starting out in research and learning their landscape? How do they form diverse and large teams like that to common goals?
You know, what's really funny is I moved to California. I didn't know anyone. I sat in my office and I cold called the Resource Conservation District.
Yep.
I had worked with resource conservation districts before. So I would really tap into what you know, even from wherever you come from. And a simple email cold call led to me working with the Forest Service and all of those partners. The other thing I would say is I'm so fortunate to work with Danielle's team, and that came because there was a need on a grant and someone had to roll off. So keep your ears open. Someone just grabbed me in the hallway and said, hey, you know, go over what is now CSU-WATER. They need your help. And so that's led to multiple projects and many years of working together. So yeah, just, you know, trying to just reach out initially is people welcome it. Yeah.
I could echo that. I mean, I moved out here. I never lived west of the Mississippi River, but for junior faculty, I dedicated every Friday afternoon to outreach, just cold call. And then before you know it, over time, it pays off. People are calling you. Can you do this kind of project? Can you put a team together? And that was ages ago, but that's the fun part, right? Is it engagement and outreach. So I echo what you're saying there. Laura Jensen, thoughts, questions for our speakers? We have about 10 or 11 minutes left in our agenda.
Yeah, I do have some questions for the speakers, but I also just want to pause and see if anybody had any questions for me or thoughts, for refining our strategies. Right now, they're very high level, but we will probably be adding more detail to them. So for instance, Jennifer, I would love if you have written materials to share, particularly on your collaborative adaptive management strategies. Like I would love to just understand that a little bit better. But any and all of you certainly would love to understand more. But I just want to pause. Does anybody have questions or feedback for me? Yeah, Jennifer?
Yeah, I would just say for the commission to generally think about how we can all work together. The CSUs just offer so much, and we're located all across the state. So I think when there's opportunities, and that is thread across teaching, service learning, and research, to think of us as that resource to come and help and, you know, help to develop these programs, but also to implement them. We just, you know, we're teaching that next generation, so it has a multi-generational impact working with us. So any consideration to that would be wonderful.
Yeah, you know, this is a little bit off topic, but I do know that one of the things we've been hearing a lot about from DWR is the fact that the pipeline is drying up for water management professionals. So there is a real need to kind of cultivate that pipeline, which is a great nexus for the students that you all are reaching and working with. So I was interested. Well, does anybody else have other questions?
I just want to echo again Jennifer's points. You know, we do talk, and so these ideas aren't totally unique to either of us. And Laura, outreaching to you too. So, how to get this to our students and the nearly 500,000 students in the CSU system, even if they don't go into the water workforce, they still need to be informed citizens and voters, and involved in policy, for example. So, just for everybody, I'm thinking, and I chat about this with Jennifer just before this webinar. The next webinar I think we'd like to do is, let's call it Teaching Water. So not just like, all right, I teach all these aquatic classes, but what innovations are you bringing to the classroom and to the future workforce and voters that address these current water topics? So Laura, for example, maybe we'll reach out to you and your counterparts in state government to see what resources, tools, links, presentations you could share to get the word out to this vast and important audience we have in the CSU system.
Yeah, that sounds
so
great.
Just stay tuned for that, right, Jennifer?
So I have what might be kind of a stupid question, but and maybe I missed it when my husband came home and let in our exuberant dog. But Lori, I was wondering if you could tell me about the snowpack shifting upslope. What is the consequence of that? Why is that of interest?
Right. So we looked at basically where the center of mass of the snowpack is, and we looked at it elevationally. So when we have 1 to 2 degrees of warming, or, you know, really any amount of warming, we're likely going to have that snowpack shifting upslope. And that can change things like, you know, if this is kind of a long-term change, where a tree line is, right? So it'll have ecological implications. Across the Western US, we've also been seeing in recent years that wildfires are shifting to higher elevations. So now we have, you know, not only maybe a dwindling snowpack, but also fire encroaching on those snow-covered areas. And of course, you know, depending on how the water mass or the center of mass shifts, that can change, you know, flooding potential and how you prepare for that downstream.
So Ali Reza, I had a question for you, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But I've heard some critiques of the United States Drought Monitor, and I just wanted to get your take on it in terms of, you know, what you think of it, and if you think that it has weaknesses.
Well, I briefly mentioned that USDM, they integrate a lot of different inputs. So they inputs, including objective inputs from all different variables in hydrologic cycle, from precipitation to soil moisture to ET. And they also get some subjective inputs from climatologists, from state climatologists, from even some farmers, from USDA forest agents. And they just combine all of them manually to come up with these maps every week. I wouldn't say that it's weak. It's certainly subjective because these. So there's an author that every week they combine these info together, and because they are just combining all of these info together, there might be some subjectivity involved. And it's not apple to apple comparison. We have a lot of different drought maps. Let's say if you look at the precipitation drought map, you can just easily compare that with what USDM gives you. So you have to be very careful about if you want to compare anything with USDM, because that's just a combination of all different. sources and variables. So yeah, that's my take on, but I think still a valuable source to be looked at.
Is Megan still on? Sorry, scanning. Oh, there's Megan. Megan, so you're hearing you talk. So I did do a little bit of thinking about, reading about, and talking about ecological drought at the very start of this effort when we were doing a bit of research. And it's a compelling concept to me, but I have a tough time kind of translating it to what it means in this very applied world of what you do to manage water and other resources leading up to and during drought. And I'm wondering if, you know, if you have a response to that, and in particular, if you are familiar with environmental watering, the concept of environmental watering plans, and what, you know, what you think the nexus is there with your work on ecological drought.
Yeah, so I think, you know, ecological drought for natural resource managers, I think to me means thinking about the things that you may have no control over because you don't actively manage water, right? It's how can we be prepared? How can you plan your activities? It's being prepared to, if you need to pull an endangered species out of a stream, if, you know, things are getting too dry and they're not going to be able to persist, you know, which we've done in Southern California. It's, you know, do you need to change your restoration plan so you're planting at a different time of year, or you completely forego a restoration project in a given year? We don't do that, but we waste a lot of money doing these things because, you know, it's slated in the budgets. I mean, part of it is our planning's not flexible. So that's where a lot of our focus is now. But I agree that the nexus with, I mean, I have heard of the environmental watering. And I think this is an important nexus for natural resource managers to be able to communicate with water managers. Obviously, in Southern California, water for people often takes up all the oxygen in the room, but we have so many threatened, and I see Jennifer laughing. It's real. Anyway, I mean, this happens in all of California, but I think it's particularly problematic in Southern California. But anyway, I think it's important that we be able to articulate what we need and want. So when we have those conversations with water managers, we can be more clear about what we are trying to accomplish and where, so then we can negotiate what that might look like.
Yeah, and I have heard that from folks that there needs to be a better articulation of what's needed. I think that, you know, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, but I think it's a tricky thought. I mean, things were going well when there were fewer people doing less things to water. So really, you know, it's about kind of going back to something that we're never going to go back to promote fully functioning ecosystems and habitat species. So yeah, how do you decide what is enough when it used to be all of it, pretty much?
No, I agree. And I think, you know, starting this discussion with people, I think natural resource managers have been on their heels a lot with this. And I think that the goal is trying to get forward. And we're maybe not, I think it's important to not necessarily look back, but look forward. What do we need to be sustainable and have the things that are most critical persist, and understanding there are some things we may need to let go. And making those tough decisions, because they're going to be made for you if you don't make them actively yourself.
Yeah, those are great points, and we're approaching the end of our agenda. And Megan, that's a good kind of exit point, because there is a lot of hashing out, negotiation, and crying and hand-wringing about land use transformation, how much water is going to environment, and everything else. And I just want to highlight the need for water economists, broadly speaking, whether it's in dollars, cents, euros, etc., or in molecules of water, or the stuff that water conserves or produces. I mean, the economic landscape is mind-boggling. Our close colleague who couldn't be here today, Anita Chowdhury, who I'm collaborating with, she's at CSU Chico. She teases me like, Steve, you're really an economist hiding as an ecologist your whole career. I'm like, it's the same thing, just different units. But my appreciation of and the necessity for economics writ large in dealing with water is going to be huge. And so if you can steer students towards that, talk to more people, learn more about it, but it's going to be a big part of our future of water sustainability. Laura, any parting words real quick? So we're hitting the end here. It's been fantastic, everybody. Thanks.
Just a huge thank you to everybody for your time and your attention. And I look forward to learning more about all of the things that were presented today in brief, and to future collaborations. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So the recordings will be on our website for events, most of the talks, and then everybody in the audience who's here or share with others, just pitch us ideas for future webinars. If you've been hearing a lot of buzz around, we're more than happy to have events like this, and even open it up to our external partners and agency friends, for example. I think that's where we need to go, actually. We could do a lot of internal things, but let's think more broadly too. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Carl, energy. Yes, of course. Thank you for that.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.